writing requirements or requirements engineering is like building a foundation. If you're building a skyscraper, you won't go very high if your foundation is not very strong, right?
Success is what the end user of that product or software is going to do. Where so many these projects go wrong is there's not that clarity.
We need a fancy UI here, people spending months and months of efforts, and at the end, if you do not have the substance under that UI layer, it's not going to work.
The problems that fundamentally come from issues with software projects is misaligned expectations and not clear enough requirements. If you start off on the wrong foot, you're going to be fighting that constantly the whole way through.
With these large language models or generative AI, you can create different agents and get them to negotiate with each other. Report that is generated out of that negotiation can be extremely helpful. Uncover your unknowns or the issues in your requirements much early on before you encounter issues later down in your development process.
Dr. Chetan Arora is a senior lecturer at Monash University, specializing in natural language processing, machine learning, and AI systems. With over a decade of experience, including work with SES satellites, he focuses on AI quality assurance. He holds a PhD in computer science. Join us for our conversation with Dr. Chetan Arora.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Chetan. It's great to have you on.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, I know you've got a lot of experience and you've done a lot of work in the requirements engineering space, and you've got a lot of experience in the industry as well. So why don't you just give us a short background about yourself and for anyone listening, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, so I have a lot of experience in requirements engineering, and I'm sure we'll talk more about what's requirements engineering and so on in the podcast. But I've worked in industry for several years in 4 different countries: India, Germany, Luxembourg, and now in Australia. And now I work at Monash University as a senior lecturer in software engineering, and I do my research in requirements engineering. But I try to collaborate with industry a lot, and that's something that I've done a lot in past as well. But yeah, so that's a good mix of industry experience and now academic experience, and working with the next generation of engineers.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, very good. What brought you out to Australia then? Obviously you've worked in quite a few different countries already, but what brought you mainly out here? Was it Monash or?
I think overall everything. So there was an internal joke that we had in my previous organization in Luxembourg. Good economy and good weather hardly goes together unless you're in Australia.
Okay. Very interesting. Good. Okay, so that gives us a bit of insight and background as to why you're here. Definitely, I like that one. Well, I know you've got a lot of experience in requirements engineering, and I'm excited for our discussion today because I want to learn a bit more about it as well, and get to know your knowledge and your understanding of it. So, how would you describe what is requirements engineering for those that probably haven't heard that term or terms before? How would you define it?
So requirements engineering is the systematic or disciplined approach of eliciting, specifying, analyzing, and maintaining requirements for any software or system that you are developing. So it's like laying down the foundation of any system or software you're developing, right? And that could be from many different stakeholders' perspective. Those could be end users, those could be developers in your system, the business owners, investors, and so on. So in short, requirements engineering is about getting to know who are your direct and indirect stakeholders. For example, government entities who build in regulations. What are your system constraints? What are your technical constraints? Who are your users? What are their real needs from the system, and so on. And also now, especially with AI, a lot of ethical aspects around the software and systems.
Yep. Okay. That's great. Would you? There's no. How do I put this? There's no silver bullet or one way to do it right necessarily. Is that there's obviously a lot of context for different projects and that kind of thing. But how, with the different frameworks out there, and that is there a certain, I suppose, let's put it, principles or a certain set of things that you should be following for requirements engineering, and and making sure that whatever requirements we are listing out is, I suppose, is there certain things from your perspective that are non-negotiables no matter what the project is?
Yeah, so I think overall, no matter the context or the type of projects, there are few steps or processes that remain consistent, right? Like you need to identify your stakeholders, no matter what kind of software system, what kind of, if you're working in a startup or a large corporation, you need to know your stakeholders. Then once you know your stakeholders, you need to talk to them and elicit those requirements from them. And those conversations, the depth of those conversations might depend on your context. And then you need to specify them, and depending upon your context, again, you need to specify them in certain level of detail, and you need to maintain a certain accuracy or preciseness of language. If you're building a software system for a safety critical, writing requirements for a safety critical system like satellite systems or space missions, or nuclear power plants, you need to be very, very precise in your requirements as compared to building an app for a certain subset of users where you have that leeway of not being as precise because you have other constraints like budget constraints and so on as well.
Yeah, very, very interesting. In your opinion, what would you say the difference is between requirements engineering and business analysis?
I think there are a lot of synergies between business, like a business analyst's role or a requirements engineer's role. Although the role requirements engineer is relatively lesser known in certain geographies, including Australia, right? We don't know what exactly is a requirements engineer. Maybe in few domains like systems engineering domains, building trains and so on. They know that, but not so much in software industry here as compared to Europe, like Germany, Sweden, and so on. So in my experience, so business analyst has a more broader scope. So that includes knowing your business needs, objectives, processes, and so on. Whereas, so requirements is focused on a slightly more technical level and on one specific software product or a system, and not so much thinking about going one level up and thinking about the entire business and so on.
Okay,
yeah,
interesting. I think with the requirements engineering side, or just requirements in general, and I totally agree. Like the requirements engineer role and requirements engineering, even as a term, is not widely known or understood, especially here. But it's so important, just in general, the requirements that when we are doing a project, we're starting a project, we're working on a project, whatever it is, the problems that fundamentally come from issues with software projects is misaligned expectations and not clear enough requirements. Basically, that's the essentially where the vast majority of things lie. Now, you can run into issues with certain technologies if you're trying to integrate them or whatever, those things do come up, but they're nowhere near as big a problem as where there's misaligned requirements and expectations, right? Where essentially you start out, I liken it to somewhat of like a foundation of a house or a building or something like that there. If you start with the wrong foundations, if you start off on the wrong foot, you're going to be fighting that constantly the whole way through. And I'd love to get your thoughts on why is it so important that not necessarily like the requirements engineering role, but just overall and more higher level, the requirements are thorough, they are right, and we've got a clear picture of what success looks like for these kind of projects.
Sure. So this is an example that I always give to my students as well, right? Or in my industry workshops. So writing requirements or requirements engineering is like building a foundation. And those are really the foundation of, if you're building a skyscraper, you won't go very high if your foundation is not very strong, right? Is the same in requirements engineering. So you need to get your requirements right. And as you mentioned, you need to align and have a common understanding among all the stakeholders. What is it that they want? So if I can give you a concrete example, 2 or 3 years ago, when I moved to Australia roughly 4 years ago, it was February 2020, just before COVID hit. And then all of a sudden, there was this flurry of COVID contact tracing apps by all the countries, including Australia, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember the COVID Safe app that came out from Australia.
Yeah, I do.
So
Yeah.
that was a classical example of failed requirements engineering for me, because if I'm not wrong, government pumped in roughly more than $20 million into that project, just one app. There were, as the outcome, only two positive cases were identified by that app. So we spent, as a tax-paying economy, more than $10 million for identifying by one COVID contact tracing. And the reason for that is there was no transparency in the projects. Nobody got the requirements right. Who is our user base? We
Yeah.
have so much diversity in Australia, right? Did we get the diversity of our user base right? And what would be their key concerns around such an application that comes from a relatively non-transparent development process, and so on?
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting case study. I think, as you mentioned, there was obviously multiple projects that went across the country with that. In Australia alone, I believe I read at the time, I think there was at least 80 to 100 million in total spent on those types of, not that specific one, but those types of applications. And most of them, I totally agree, were obviously it was an unprecedented time, if that makes sense, and decisions were made quickly and things. But I agree with what you're saying. At the end of the day, whatever the project is that what are we trying to do here? Like, are we all actually aligned? Do we know what success looks like, or are we
Exactly.
setting ourselves up to fail? Now, the question I ask, because we run into this as well, and I know I have this question myself a lot, and I'm, not second guessing, probably not the right word, but it's like, where do you draw the line? Okay, so we can spend, especially when we're talking with large kind of behemoth projects, or really large projects, if that makes sense, that we're trying to take on. We could do requirements engineering or discovery or whatever we want to call it for a year, 2 years, right? But then we've
Yeah.
lost that year or 2 years, right? Where we've tried to map up every single detail, and what we did 6 months ago is now irrelevant because we've just moved along already so fast. So I don't think there's any necessary right answer to this as well, but I'd love to get your thoughts on, like, where's that line? How do we know enough is enough? And is it fair to say that we can't necessarily know every detail before starting the project, especially obviously in software, but we need to know what success looks like, and then we can just work back from that?
Yeah. So I think so. Requirements completeness, as we call it, is $1 million question, right? So when do you know the
Yeah.
requirements are complete? So there is no silver bullet or like a metric that would say, okay, now you have 100% requirements, because there are a lot of unknowns in the whole process. But I think what really matters is that, if you, depending upon your constraints, right, and every project or every organization has those constraints, keeping those constraints in mind, if you follow a relatively rigorous process in identifying your stakeholders, trying to uncover those unknowns from stakeholders early on, because stakeholders could be end users or investors, or people in general might be um, hiding deliberately or indeliberately some information from you as a requirements engineer, or a project manager. So because people think it is obvious, people just think, you should know that because this is obvious in our domain,
Yeah.
or people are just apprehensive of certain things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think establishing clear objectives and criteria, using prioritization techniques, like, okay, this is the priority of the stakeholders as of now, and we start building on that, and getting that stakeholder agreement and sign off is one way of saying, okay, now is enough, when we have the prioritized features or requirements, and then we have a sign off from whoever wants the system built.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I think that's great. I want to touch off on one point you mentioned there around assumptions or stakeholders. Oh yeah, we should just know that because that's our industry, or that's what we do, or whatever else. But people sometimes don't realize that, especially when, for us, we work with obviously external companies, and we're developing products for them, and we work with a wide range of industries, but it's mostly more your traditional industries like manufacturing and wholesale, industrial services, and that kind of thing. But it can be a challenge sometimes where people, like you'll come into a business or something and it's not necessarily their fault, but they're like, oh yeah, well, this is just how it happens kind of thing, right? And it's like, well, okay, we can't just make assumptions that everyone knows that, right? We need to make that clear, because the assumptions will cost us later. And it's just assuming that people understand, or assuming that we're aligned, or assuming that it's clear. We can't do that, right? We've got to have it laid out clear. And I think what you suggested is great, is that we have that alignment with the stakeholders, that this is the objectives, with the OKRs, the objectives, key results, or this is kind of the North Star of where we're going. And if we can achieve that, we would have seen success. If we can get that, that just means that we're all aligned from the beginning, rather than, I suppose, focusing on features necessarily. With every single stakeholder, we're focusing on outcomes, but then we're taking those outcomes and developing the requirements that need to be done to actually meet those.
Yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree to it. So I think aligning with all the stakeholders, making sure that you're not missing a stakeholder, right? That's also very understated thing, and people think this is obvious that you will not miss a stakeholder, but that happens all the time. People don't even know this was an important user group for me, and they realize it much later on. And then aligning with all these stakeholders and getting in their requirements, and some of them might be directly related to the features you're building. But for example, how do you take into account regulatory requirements? Those are not directly related to your features, but then those are very, very important and can have make or break decisions on several aspects of the software or the system that you're building. So I think, so I agree. So aligning with the stakeholders and getting that sign off from them, like they are happy with the current information that you have about the system right now.
Yeah. Now, just jumping a bit further into this, we touched on a little bit earlier as well, but kind of Agile versus Waterfall and requirements engineering in that, and getting on onto that topic. And I know there's so many different opinions, especially when it comes to Agile, if that makes sense, and so many different comments, I suppose, is the way to put it. And a lot of people say that they are doing Agile when they're not really. It's just Waterfall disguised as Agile. And then there's a lot to it. What I'm trying to say is it's not simple, and you would understand this a lot as well. But essentially, the idea very simply with a Waterfall project is we have fully scoped requirements, a fixed scope from the beginning, and that does not change, that does not vary. Essentially, that's the scope. Whereas Agile is, we've got a flexible scope, and we may have some constraints around a timeline or that there, but the scope itself and the requirements may actually change during that period of time, expand, contract, etc. as well. Now, I'm very much oversimplifying this as well, but I'd love to get your thoughts on like the difference between them to you, and then kind of requirements engineering in Agile, and then versus Waterfall.
Yep. So I think, so first of all, in terms of commonalities and differences, the commonality is in both the processes, you want to get this shared common understanding of all the stakeholders what you're trying to build. And that's key to whether you're using Agile or Waterfall, and to understand the risks that are involved in both Agile and Waterfall. And of course, in Agile settings, you have more iterative and incremental approach. As you mentioned, that this is requirements engineering is more of an ongoing activity rather than Waterfall, where you do requirements, and then you stop at a certain point. And then you say, okay, this is my requirements, freeze. And but still in Agile as well, you have to specify requirements as user stories, backlogs, or Jira requests in some ways. I think one key difference is that in Agile, this constant involvement of the stakeholders.
Yep.
That doesn't really happen in Waterfall, or just happens and then it stops at a certain point. That's the key for Agile, like getting that regular interaction. But that also doesn't mean that Agile, as you rightly mentioned, sometimes people what do is a messed up Waterfall is what they call as Agile, or like iterative Waterfall is not Agile.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And one of the key points that you touched off on there, I think, which is super important for me, is that constant stakeholder involvement of where mainly around, okay, if we've got a smaller project, then yeah, we can define the scope, etc. But when we're tackling large, complex projects, it is an iterative thing. And I had a conversation the other week with Martin Dahlman about this, the author of Sprint Goals, the book around sprint goals, and we were having a discussion around this topic as well. And his point was, you know the least about a project when you begin, right? And it's so difficult for us to map out every single requirement at that point because we actually know the least about the project. And so trying to what we need to do is map out what we do know and as best we can, but we have to be open to the fact that those things are going to expand and change as we learn and we go throughout the project. And that's why I think it's so important. And obviously with where software has come over, the evolution of software engineering, et cetera, with kind of Waterfall now, most stuff moving to Agile, especially for these large projects, is the fact that we simply, no matter how much work we put in, we talk about that requirement completeness, aren't going to know everything until we actually start building or getting into the project.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think another factor to Agile is people think that by being Agile means I'm not documenting anything. So I do not have to write anything, and that might work, as you mentioned, in a small setting, or everything is developed by an in-house development for a startup with 3 or 4 people. They're going to stick to the company. Nobody's leaving anytime soon, and they have everything in their mind, and you don't need to have extensive documentation. But Agile doesn't mean that you do not have the requirements gathering, your product owners sitting somewhere geographically, and your development team somewhere completely different. And then you cannot just get away from documenting. And as you mentioned, your example of sprint goals, you know the least when you start, but then as you progress, you know more, and you do not want to lose that knowledge as you go. So you need to document that so that you maintain that consistent understanding throughout the project.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. What do you think is what does great requirements look like? I suppose obviously we've touched off on the stakeholders, right? Needing to make sure we've touched off on every stakeholder, but for the team working on the project, I suppose like across the board, what does great requirements look like? Not necessarily like specifically from every area, but I suppose overall, what does it give us, and what are some key things that we would look for?
I think there are certain ISO standards, right, like 2914, right, from my memory, that define the quality attributes for requirements. The requirements need to be complete, not just that the set of requirements need to complete. If you write a requirements statement, it needs to be complete by itself. It needs to be smart, which means specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Like you cannot say, if I for example, a very common usability requirement that people use is the system should be usable.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Yeah,
the system should be usable.
Yeah.
So it means that you need to define the system, who is it usable for, then it needs to respond, say, within a few milliseconds, and then you define what is that milliseconds during peak usage times, and what are those peak usage times for your system, for instance. Or your system's available in terms of reliability 99.9% of the times. So what does that 99.9% mean in your context? I think to some extent we are also touching on functional and non-functional requirements. And non-functional part of the requirements is something that people miss out on, or do not pay too much attention on. That's the quality requirements. So coming back to your specific questions, yeah. So I think the requirements need to be precise, complete, consistent. So across the document, things are consistent, and so on.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that. And what would your comments be on presenting these requirements to internal stakeholders, right? So for someone like us, we're building, applications, we're working on projects for large organizations that are external, for example, but we have stakeholders that are the end user of the application, e.g. the customer of our customer or client, if that makes sense. But we also have opinions and internal stakeholders, or what we'd call internal, which is at the company that we're working with or the client, if that makes sense. And they think, they know that this should be done, or this is the idea that should be done, if that makes sense. And we might actually talk to the end users and we figure out something else, etc. But that's one part of it. Another part of it is when we do this requirements engineering or this discovery we presented, etc. Sometimes it can be overwhelming as well to non-technical stakeholders, is the way I'd put it. Now, I'd love to get your thoughts on, like, are there any ideas or processes, etc., on how we can, I suppose, sum up, not necessarily give every bit of information so it becomes overwhelming, but we're demonstrating that this is what we need to do. And from our perspective and how this has worked well is trying to dumb things down isn't necessarily the right way to put it, but essentially summarize things for those maybe non-technical stakeholders where it's like, well, here's the objectives, here's what success looks like, and here's higher level what's going to be done, but we're taking out the granular details that don't need to be there.
Yep. I think the one of the most important, now this also touches on what are the attributes of a good requirements engineer, right? And one of the main attributes, according to me, is they should know how to talk to technical users, so technical stakeholders and non-technical stakeholders. They should be able to present the same ideas to technical stakeholders, in the sense like, this is how this is going to look like. But to your specific question, I think presenting them in their language, using their terminology is very important. So understanding what is the terminology that they understand. It could be related to domain, it could be related to just their level of understanding of things. So picking on that terminology and then explaining things from a user's perspective, for example, is very important. So this is what a scenario, almost like telling a story, right? This is what the scenario would look like if you use the system. As compared to when you talk to your technical stakeholders, you need to tell them that as well, because this is something that is taken for granted as well, that technical users will understand the language of non-technical stakeholders. And that doesn't happen often, right? Because they do not even get or think about in what context or what scenarios are people going to use the system eventually.
Yeah.
And that's why there is this gap in understanding between the two important stakeholder groups. So as a requirements engineer, it's your job to bridge that gap as much as you can. And that might include iteratively telling or one-on-one communication with people over certain iterations as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's some really good advice. Now, jumping into prioritization, right, around requirements and that kind of, because when we get into, again, larger projects and we start involving a large amount of stakeholders, different groups of stakeholders, etc., especially, we know that there's always a lot of requirements and there's always different opinions, right, at the table as to what should be prioritized first, etc. My big thing comes back to, what is the actual end user or the user that we're trying to target? What do they think? And then, what research have we done on them? Because we can have all the opinions, and we know, like, we've worked with people that have been in industries for decades, 30, 40, 50 years, whatever. And we're building a product for them or something like that there. And they think that they know what the customer or the end user wants and needs. But again, when you dig down, it is assumptions, if that makes sense. Here's what we think they need and everything else. When you actually find out, it's like, no, it's something completely different. And there is sometimes this battle between, this is probably another topic, we can get into this a bit after this, I guess, but his battle between pleasing the internal stakeholders, but also, most importantly, success is what the end user of that product or software is going to do. So how do you handle that situation, and how should we prioritize the requirements And what do you think around that? What's some techniques with that?
I think the first step towards prioritizing requirements is actually knowing what are you trying to prioritize. People think this is obvious, but this is not obvious as well, right? Like, are you trying to prioritize the importance of certain features from a user's perspective, importance of those features from your technical stakeholders' perspective, cost of implementation,
Yeah.
overall cost of the project? Are you trying to mitigate risk, and that's what you're trying to prioritize? That, okay, I do my most risky requirements first because then that will reduce my level of risk in the project, or I do the other way, I do the least risky bits first, so that at least I have a minimum viable product. Or for instance, can I try to optimize my any hindrances or duration of implementation?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And I think in terms of actually prioritizing, there are a few models. For example, there's a model called a Moscow model, like you have must haves, should haves, could haves, and won't haves. um, or on similar lines, there is this Kano model, which is what are your dissatisfiers, which is people take these things for obviously they take these things for granted, they should be in the system. Dissatisfiers, for example, so if I give you a concrete example, so recently we were working with a client who's building an app with that encourages movement for people with a certain type of health condition. And for these users, a dissatisfier is like, you are accurately calculating my movements, because that's like the core feature, and
Yeah.
or the fact that you do you want them to log in. The next level is satisfiers. That is something that users really want and are explicitly telling you that I want that. That, for example, in that was that you give them timely notifications. Like, you should not give them notification 1 hour after they were supposed to move, but also taking common sense things like you do not send them movement notifications when they're driving. And the third level in Kano model is delighters. That's really that brings the sparkle in your user's eye, right?
Yeah.
Like, wow,
Yeah.
I didn't expect that. This is such a pleasant surprise. Like, in that particular example, like connectivity of this app to your Apple Watch and taking your data and giving personalized motivations and personalized notifications. That's really a delight for people, right? Like, this is the type of motivation that works for me. I'm super happy that you put it in there, and I was not expecting that. Yeah, so these are some of the prioritization techniques.
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest challenge that we come up against, you see, is that again, it's coming back to that misalignment with the stakeholders of who's actually controlling the project, whether it's an internal project or an external project, whatever it is. But okay, what are we prioritizing for? What's the most important thing? Okay, is the most important thing that we meet budget? Okay, yes, then we may have to be flexible on scope, right? We may have to be, right? Because if that's the thing, this is how these projects go, right? We can't just define everything, especially when we're talking large ones, so we may have to be flexible. But if that's the most important thing, then we go, okay, we'll meet budget and we'll deliver a minimum viable product, but we can't say that we'll deliver everything necessarily. Okay. And maybe no, budget's not the most important. The most important is that we achieve this outcome. Right? This is the outcome here, right? Which is, we want users to be able to do X, or we want to completely eliminate this, or users should be doing this, or whatever it is. And so we go, okay, so we deploy whatever necessary within reason to make that happen. And I totally agree with you, but I think where the biggest issue, and we know this through experience, but in these kind of projects, is that's not clear enough as to what are we prioritizing for.
Yeah.
What are the expectations that we're trying to deliver here, right? Because then we go and prioritize on, okay, well, let's just prioritize what's easiest. As you said, what's the least risk? Let's just go and do that. But then it might be like, oh, why is this not done yet? Or, like internal stakeholder might jump back in and say, why are we doing that? That's not the priority. And it's like, well, okay, we must have been misaligned at the beginning, right? With what the priority was. And I think it's really, really important to get that alignment, to know. I think it comes back to not only the prioritization, but it's part of that. But we're talking about overall, what is the success of the project? What are we actually trying to achieve? And it sounds simple and it sounds obvious. People are like, yeah, no joke. Like we need to know what success looks like. We need to know what the outcome looks like. But where so many these projects go wrong is there's not that clarity between stakeholders. Yeah. People don't know what that looks like, which means that all the other questions that follow as to, okay, what do we prioritize first, right? Okay, what are our flexibilities? What do we need to be doing first? What do we actually deliver in, our first MVP, or in the MVP in phase 1 or whatever else? Like, all of these things become a lot easier when we know like a concrete alignment across the board, across every single person as to this is what we need to be doing. Right. Yeah. So I think it's something for us. Well, we've learned that the hard way. Essentially, what projects and stuff have you seen that on, and have you seen the same thing or?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's having that open communication across the stakeholders, right? Like you mentioned that everyone should be aware what are we trying to prioritize on, and why are we trying to prioritize on that, right? Because if you're a startup, then your constraints are very different from a company that has a lot of money to spend in the project, or your government entity who's just contracting someone to develop something that reasonably works and so on. So it's very important to do that. And I think it's also very important, in my experience, what I've seen is one of the common problems that in prioritization is that people are generally overexcited about what are delighters, and then somehow trade off the satisfiers for those delighters. And that's both the non-technical users and technical users, because technical stakeholders try to woo the end users or the investors in some cases. Oh, look, this is so cool, but then you should not be compromising or putting the satisfiers at a lower priority, or those are your should haves also and must haves.
Yeah, it's shiny objects, right? Like it looks cool, it sounds cool, but it actually delivers no real value. And this is where I sound like a broken record, I do, but it keep coming back to the fact of like, what are we trying to achieve here, right? And is that specific thing driving us in the right? Is it moving the needle in the right direction for what that outcome is, right? So we might come up with this really cool, fancy idea, right? But when we truly look at it at its core, and we speak to the end users, whatever else, we realize that, sounds cool, but it's not actually going to move the needle in the right. So why are we spending budget? Why are we spending time and effort on pursuing that further? At this doesn't mean we don't look at it in the future, but at this point in time, it is not a significant contributor to what the outcome or the North Star is that we're trying to achieve, essentially, or where we're headed. And I think a big part of that is like, I've seen so many of these projects go off the rails or be derailed or have massive issues because of this. There's just no clear alignment. There's no clear expectations right across the stakeholders, and we end up 6 months, 12 months down the track, and it's like, okay, is this what we wanted? Right? Rather than knowing, okay, no, if we achieve this in this time period, or we move towards this objective, this outcome, everyone's going to be happy. Right? I think, and too many people are focusing on, if we can deliver a refreshed UI, right, or we can do that, then, and what does that mean? Why are we doing that? What outcome are we trying to drive? Where are we trying to go? And it's those things, just in my opinion, have to be crystal clear.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like you rightly mentioned, fancy UI is the keyword that I've heard so many times in my career. So we need a fancy UI. Here are people spending months and months of efforts trying to fancify that UI, and at the end, if you do not have the substance under that UI layer, it's not going to work.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I was talking about that and the design side. I was speaking to Pavel Samsonov as well a week or so ago around this as well, where we were talking about, he was talking about why are we doing this? And then when you get to that, why are we doing that, right? Everything should have a why behind it. And I think all of this kind of links together is the fact that we have to know why we're doing something and what impact it's going to have, and what we're actually trying to achieve, because that's a huge part of it. Now, I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of generative AI and that mainly around requirements engineering. I know you've done some research around that as well, but with Gen AI in requirements engineering, what are your thoughts on using it for kind of creating requirements as an assistant there, research, et cetera, et cetera? What do you reckon about it overall?
So I think I get super excited about this topic because this has always been my research. But also I see a lot of practical impact of that, right? So I work with companies who are trying to implement Gen AI for requirements. So I see a huge potential for generative AI, right? Especially, for instance, after ChatGPT is mainly focused on generating text. And as we've talked so far, requirements engineering has a major part of that is actual documentation of requirements in text format.
Yeah.
So there is huge implications of generative AI for requirements engineering, and whether that's um, specifying requirements consistently, precisely, and so on. So Gen AI can be a very smart assistant for you, or checking consistency of requirements of large requirements document, which is very time consuming for a human if they want to do that. And Gen AI can point you in the right directions. Look, there might be something missing here or there. And some things that we have tried, and not many people are trying, are negotiation of requirements, which is very, very important. So not many people know that with these what large language models or generative AI, you can create different agents and get them to negotiate with each other over your given set of requirements. And the outcomes or the report that is generated out of that negotiation can be extremely helpful for organizations that would help you uncover your unknowns or the issues in your requirements much early on before you encounter issues later down in your development process.
Yeah.
And the cost of doing that is not so much, right? Because you just let it run for, say, 5 minutes. Somebody reviews that report, half an hour, and then you uncover issues. There's no harm in doing that. However, so of course, there are a lot of issues if you use Gen AI, depending upon your context, right? So if you're building a mission critical space mission, then probably do not upload your requirements to a public large language model. That's not a very good idea. And so on. Or there are ethical implications, right? So if you're using it in healthcare, so it might not understand some of the nuances of the domain, right? But take it as a smart assistant, but you need a human oversight in the loop at all the times. That doesn't mean that you blindly trust. And this is what happens most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's certainly there's a lot of potential there, and standardizing things, if that makes sense, reviewing again as an assistant, like what do we do here? What's missing? Just allowing us to do more at scale. Essentially, doesn't mean it's perfect. I totally agree where we've got oversight, etc. But it can be a buddy or as such where you're working, and you can do so many things with it. I do myself have concerns around the research, like people using it as research and using it to generate requirements. And what I mean by this is, like, they are saying, oh, here's what I want to do, give me all the requirements. And it's like, it's just giving you a generic list of requirements, if that makes sense. Like, there's so many nuances to your situation, the context, your industry, what you're specifically trying to achieve, the outcomes for you, if that makes sense. All of these different things that, yes, and whilst you can provide as much as you can with that, a lot of this comes down to you're trying to, the nuances at this point, it is not, at least in my experience, and we're using it a lot, if that makes sense, to test these things out, but it's not there in regards to doing that. But where it is great is when we know what we're trying to do, if that makes sense, we can standardize things, we can find our gaps, we can do all of this stuff, as you've said, and it can really help us.
Yes, absolutely. So, just a little bit of self promotion. So, we at Monash were the first ones in the world to actually do a systematic analysis on the usage of generative AI in requirements engineering, and we published a book chapter on that and so on. And one of the outcomes of that research was, so we did an experiment with people who had industry experience in requirements management, requirements engineering, and the people or students who were recent graduates with not so much of industry real world experience, and we use them for exactly this task, generating requirements for a given project specification. So this is a project brief. Can you generate requirements and give us a final set of requirements which you're happy with? And you can use ChatGPT. The level of confidence of the experienced people was much lower as compared to the inexperienced people. There is this Dunning-Kruger effect that inexperienced people do not even know what's wrong or missing in this thing. And the quality of requirements from the experienced people was much better as compared to the inexperienced people.
Yeah. No, I definitely, and I agree. You don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
You and the same applies. We're talking about requirements engineering. The same applies with any use of Gen AI, or whether it's you actually engineering or whether you're developing or coding, etc., even design and that kind of thing. Is that it's like having a mentor that. Do you actually know if that mentor is good or not, if that makes sense, right? Like as
Yeah.
in now, obviously, if you have a mentor, you want to make sure they're good essentially. But if you're just blindly trusting it and you have no idea and you're not doing your own research and then you're really setting yourself up to fail in that regard, because you don't really have any idea whether it's good or not, right? Like you can't point to something and say, I know from my own experience that that's not good enough, so we can't use that. I think that's definitely interesting. Now, just a final one to touch off on before we close, is kind of just the CPRE and kind of your role there and what you do there.
So CPRE is the Certified Professional for Requirements Engineering certification that is given by International Requirements Engineering Board. So I am one of the members of International Requirements Engineering Board, and I reckon until now I'm the only member from Australia. And I'm also part of their AI interest group, which is a smaller group where we meet every month and discuss what are the new upcoming topics and how do they impact requirements engineering, and then whether they should be part of the outreach from IREB to the outer world, for example, via LinkedIn and so on. And also as a part of the teaching material eventually, right? Because because it's a certification for requirements engineers, so they should also know everything that is new, right? Like Gen AI and so on. So my role there is I'm an affiliated member of the board, but the main thing about CPRE is a certification for anyone. Oh, it's a globally recognized certification for anyone who wants to work as a requirement engineer.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's obviously there's a lot of information there available if for anyone that's wanting to check out the CPRE. And I know you've got your kind of handbooks, playbooks and stuff all around requirements engineering. So some really good information, some good content there. And then obviously the main goal being, the certification as well. I suppose, where are you intending on not taking it, I suppose, is the way to go, but essentially around you're wanting to see as many people certified as possible, I guess, globally.
Of course, I think especially so. I think they're going to reach a milestone soon, which is 100,000 CPRE basic foundation level certifications are going to be touched soon. So they're almost there, which is amazing. But I think for me personally, the way I see it is, I would love to bring that understanding to Australia. It is there somewhere, but it's not as widely accepted or known. Like if people go for interviews here, people don't talk about requirements engineering in general, right?
Yeah.
Or so I think it would be amazing to bring this to Australia in general and the certification would be a vehicle for people to do things right, and eventually, as a country or as an economy, we'll be able to build right high quality systems.
Yeah. No, I think that's amazing, and that's awesome. Well, I appreciate the chat we've had today, Chetan. It's been really, really good. I think we've touched off on a lot of topics. We've touched off on a lot of different things, and you've shared a lot of good insights. I appreciate that. I do a finale segment just with each guest where I ask a couple of questions. So I'd love to get into those now. The first one is, what's one thing you believe businesses are not paying enough attention to right now that will be critical in the next 5 years?
I think, in my experience, one of the things that I've noticed in working with several organizations as a researcher is not finding the right balance in terms of AI. Some organizations are over hesitant, while the others are jumping into this bandwagon of let's try this AI for everything, even if it's not applicable.
Mm-hmm.
So in the next
Yeah.
5 years, it's very important that they find this balance of where does it work for us. And I think this is where the roles of business analysts comes in. And it's very important to have those business analysts who do this proper analysis, keeping in the mind the priorities of the businesses, and then see how can we leverage AI to improve our position in the market.
Yeah. Awesome. I totally agree with you. The second one is, what legacy do you want to leave in your industry, and how do you hope your work will influence or shape the future?
I think probably two facets there. One is, I would love overall for us to move in a direction of building user-centered and ethical systems. That's an important part of, and why I'm so passionate about requirements engineering, because that's the foundation. And the second thing is more me related to, or my background, which is, now I live in Australia and this is my home, I assume forever. What I would love to do here is bridge the gap between academia and industry, which is huge as compared to several other developed countries where I've lived, like, for example, Germany and Luxembourg, right? Where that gap is not much. Industry and academia work hand in hand, because the innovation and the research at the universities inform the industry. I've seen that happening in some pockets in Australia, but not as systematically, or not in a way that can have a much larger impact for our country or for our economy. To be that, like, if people think about Australia, like when we think about Germany, right? We think German quality systems. Do we say the same about Australian built systems, right? Maybe that is one direction that I would love to move forward to. Like, can we be known for our innovation and for our industry and universities to work together?
Okay. And the final one is, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self at the start of your career?
I think one advice that I would give to my younger self would be to embrace the learning opportunities outside of my comfort zone. And one of that is, so I was very good technically, so I learned a lot of maths or technical stuff like programming and so on. But for instance, I would have, if I could go back in time, I would also like to study something around psychology, for instance, because of the type of job I do, right? Working in requirements engineering, psychology is a very important part of that. Working with humans, and now also working as a trainer in some ways with the next generation of engineers or entrepreneurs. So I would love to learn. I wish I had learned more about psychology in the past.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time, Chetan. It's been a great chat. Anyone that wants to check you out can find you out on LinkedIn as well, and find your stuff online, and check out the CPRE as well. And yeah, I think it's been a great discussion. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate your time. And anyone listening, you can check out more episodes and more content at our YouTube channel, or on Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts, or you check out the Learning Centre at Intuji.com as well. And yeah, thanks again for listening. Thanks, Chetan. It's great to have you on.
Thank you.